Russian police quickly swooped in on the opposition leader.
Navalny is getting a lot of traction with young people.
Бессонов российского политика выпустили из отделения полиции накануне вечером.
Navalny has been basking in the love of Western politicians and Western media.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we've been tracking this week. Both Russia and Cambodia have elections upcoming. It's not a great time to be an opposition figure or journalist in either. Having difficulty getting followers on Twitter? That's okay. Just buy some. More journalists have been arrested in Turkey over a story the government's clearly sensitive about. And the alternative swearing-in ceremony in Nairobi that was meant to send a political message. Russia's presidential election takes place about 6 weeks from now. The Kremlin has been clamping down on critical voices, and as the opposition politician at the heart of this story, Alexei Navalny will tell you there's nothing particularly subtle about the government's tactics. Navalny was arrested last weekend. His YouTube-based channel was shut down in the middle of a broadcast. He was probably banking on the attention that he gets from global news outlets. International coverage, along with his online following, have been central to Navalny's media strategy, as the Kremlin has steadily tightened the screws on domestic news outlets. Over the past few years, ownership of mass media in Russia has shifted almost entirely into the hands of the Kremlin's allies. Moscow has also blocked access to VPNs, the virtual private networks that allowed citizens to circumvent censorship online. And a new law is in the works that would require some journalists and bloggers to register as foreign agents. It's no wonder that the loudest voices in Russia these days are those who call President Vladimir Putin a national savior. Our starting point this week is Moscow. Not to sell Alexei Navalny short, but his arrest last weekend in Moscow does not really fall under the category of breaking news in Russia. It's the fourth time Navalny's been arrested since calling for a boycott of a presidential election in which he has been banned from running. Both his arrest and the storming of his foundation's YouTube studio in mid-broadcast were tailor-made moments for the media.
Доброе утро! Еще раз вы смотрите новости на канале Навальный Лайф. И главная новость происходит прямо сейчас.
That sound you hear is a chainsaw, the police playing their part in the news spectacle.
This particular video is pretty dramatic. During the conversation that the hosts are having while the police is trying to break through the door,
Хорошо, удостоверение ваше покажете?
they're calling themselves journalists. But if you're working for a politician and this is a political channel, probably you're not really a journalist. This whole video falls into Alexei Navalny's campaign strategy. He knows if he goes out, he will probably be arrested, and the footage that you saw was done quite professionally. You see two young girls looking at him with admiration as if he were some celebrity.
This is an opportunity to mobilize supporters and perhaps acquire new ones. Because if he doesn't produce media events, he will disappear as a politician. It's also an opportunity to show one more time to the global community that the leader of a protest has been arrested and isolated. And when the Western media covers the arrest, it helps him build his image overseas. Somebody has to cover Alexei Navalny, since Russian news outlets owned or controlled by the Kremlin have effectively blackballed him. Western news organizations, however, have never met a Russian dissident they didn't like.
Is it worth your life? Because there is a big target on you, no question.
Whether it's a Soviet-era Sakharov or Solzhenitsyn, or a Navalny today.
Your position.
They tend to give the Navalny story the surface treatment. The one-time blogger, the anti-corruption crusader, who bypassed pro-Putin news media by using social media to take on the Kremlin. Where the foreign coverage tends to fall short, though, is the Navalny backstory, his past flirtations with Russian nationalist movements. In 2007, he likened Muslims to insects. In 2008, it was Georgians. He called them rodents and said they should all be deported from Russia. And in 2013, he publicly backed nationalist skinheads who attacked immigrants.
That used to be one of the main points of criticism of Alexei Navalny is his nationalistic ideas, but recently he tried to shift more to mainstream liberal values. So I don't think that Western media didn't notice some nationalistic ideas. They just don't write about this now because he doesn't say anything nationalistic anymore.
Navalny's base of support is not in Moscow, it is not in Russia, but it is mostly in the West, among American government officials, among American media, and some European governments that believe that his political activities in Russia benefit them. And that is why in the Western media, Navalny is presented as a martyr, but the reality is that the government in Russia is quite lenient when it comes to Navalny and his supporters.
Because even though Vladimir Putin has authoritarian tendencies, his government applies them quite selectively. Politically, that means a dissident like Alexei Navalny gets arrested frequently, but is never locked up for long. The Kremlin takes a similar approach to the news media. Again, it can act in authoritarian ways, but falls somewhere short of being dictatorial.
The first thing Vladimir Putin did when he came to power in 2000 was arresting the owner of NTV channel. He obtained control over TV pretty quickly. Then he took control over the biggest internet newspapers like Gazeta.ru, Lenta.ru, but then social networks became very important. And he faced the problem that he cannot just close Facebook. So this is the biggest challenge now for the Kremlin.
There is a cluster of media outlets that the state directly influences in terms of editorial policy. Channel 1 and Vegaterka, for example, both of which are state-owned channels. Then there are media outlets owned by large businesses that are loyal to the state. This includes Channel 5, Izvestia, and REN TV. There is no doubt that there are lists of people like Navalny who are banned from appearing on these channels. And then there are oppositional media, such as Novaya Gazeta, Media Zona, and Meduza, which take the counter position more. And media executives have developed an internal system of values where they self-censor over what kinds of things they can and cannot say. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep their jobs.
But still, if you are not a very big informational source, if you have less than 1 million viewers per month, usually they will allow you to exist.
There's a reason for that. Vladimir Putin understands that he does not need to control all of the Russian news media, just the bulk of it, the major players. Which is why, for the most part, the Kremlin leaves newspapers alone, knowing that print journalism is nowhere near as influential as television. And by tolerating the existence of an independently minded radio station like Echo Moscow, or a relatively small critical television outlet, Dozhd, there is just enough media plurality in Russia for the government's defenders to say things like this.
Contrary to popular Western opinion, not all media in Russia support government positions. There are opposition magazines and newspapers. There are opposition radio stations. Navalny has access to newspapers and magazines. He has access to radio. He has access to Dozhd channel, for example. And despite all that, we see in the last few months, in the last year, that he has not been able to garner significant support.
With Alexei Navalny effectively neutralized, that clears the way for Russian mainstream media outlets to focus on the job at hand, which is casting Vladimir Putin, the president who stood up to the West during the showdown over Ukraine, as the savior that Russia and Russians need.
They are only focused on how bad is everything in Ukraine.
Уж сколько на Украине было митингов против коррупции.
How bad the situation is in the European Union because of immigration, because it's explained like invasion of Muslims in Europe. They try to explain that Russia is the only one island in the ocean of crisis of economy and values. And Vladimir Putin is the one who is defending us from this invasion.
There is a specific narrative that they are trying to push right now. There's this documentary about Putin restoring an ancient monastery in Valam, in the northern part of Russia.
Герой. Образец для подражания. Верующий президент, атакующий сильно.
And the message of this story is to try to combine some sort of religious narrative and Putin's ability to restore justice, to bring order, and to show him as this national savior. So that sort of religious sentiment that plays here is something that the Kremlin is trying to exploit.
That added religious element suggests that after all these years, Russian news outlets are still managing to find new ways to showcase Vladimir Putin. As far as most of the mainstream media are concerned, this story is about a national savior, he who must not be questioned, against a flawed outsider, he who must not be mentioned. It's no contest, and that's just how the Kremlin likes it. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar today with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, the Turkish government has made another series of arrests. Journalists are among those being held. What exactly are they accused of?
Yeah, so this most recent crackdown is much like many others in Turkey. It's all about, quote, silencing the spread of terrorist propaganda. Turkey's interior minister announced the arrest of more than 300 people, including politicians, activists, and at least 4 journalists. They'd all written social media posts criticizing the government's attacks on the Kurdish YPG militia in the Syrian province of Afrin. The news outlets affected are the Mesopotamian News Agency, RTTV, the online independent newspaper T24, and the leftist online paper Halkin Nabzi.
Now, Turkey has a track record of arbitrary arrests, especially since the failed coup in 2016. What's driving this latest round?
Well, Ankara seems determined to control the media narrative on what it calls Operation Olive Branch. The military campaign was launched with the goal of, quote, crushing the Kurdish militia, the YPG. The government in Ankara claimed the YPG has ties to the PKK, a Kurdish separatist movement that the ruling AK party calls a terrorist group. The majority of media outlets in Turkey, who are increasingly pro-government, have supported the intervention in Syria. But the government is clearly uneasy about any dissent that might derail its campaign.
The other story you're looking into is an expose of a company that is alleged to sell followers on Twitter, a so-called follower factory. First of all, who broke that story?
The New York Times. So they've published an extensive, comprehensive investigation, really lifting the lid, unveiling a whole world of fake social media accounts and the companies behind them. The report revolves around one specific company, Devumi, which sells Twitter followers to businesses, celebrities, even politicians. The way it works is that Devumi creates fake accounts on Twitter, and these bots can then be automated to follow, retweet, even like Devumi's clients' posts. But this is not just about popularity for popularity's sake. For celebrities and other so-called online influencers, more followers means more money. According to the data company Captivate, an influencer with 1 million followers can actually earn $20,000 for a single tweet promoting a brand or product.
Sure, but how widespread a problem are we talking about here, and what, if anything, is being done to fix it?
Well, what's become clear is that the sale and use of Twitter bots is now pretty common. The Times report quoted estimates putting the percentage of fake Twitter accounts as high as 15%, and that Devumi itself has sold more than 200 million followers in total, though the company's founder does deny his company has actually sold any fake followers. Among Devumi's customers named in the investigation are a CNN contributor, Hillary Rosen, and an editor at the Chinese state-run news agency, Xinhua. As for what's being done about it, well, the answer is not very much. Although Twitter's terms of use clearly state that users are not allowed to buy followers, the company's value is directly linked to the number of Twitter accounts in circulation. So you can really see why it might choose not to be particularly vigilant in dealing with these fake accounts.
Okay, thanks, Flo. Cambodia is another country with an election coming up. The vote is 5 months away, and it was conceivable that the government of Hun Sen, the world's longest-serving prime minister, could have lost its parliamentary majority. But Cambodians are now seeing a concerted campaign to silence opposition figures, NGOs, and news outlets that refuse to toe the official line. 3 months ago, the government dissolved the main opposition party, arrested its leader on charges of treason, which prompted more than half of the opposition's MPs to flee the country. Multiple media outlets, both on the airwaves and in print, have been forced to shut down over tax evasion charges that journalists say have been manufactured to silence voices of dissent. The Listening Post's Johanna Husnow on the state of democracy in Cambodia and an information blackout that is by government design.
Meet Hun Sen, Cambodia's prime minister. Just last week, he celebrated his 33rd year in power, and in July, he will face his 6th election. After losing a significant share of the vote to the opposition in 2013, he and his ruling party, the CPP, are no longer leaving much to chance. In the last few months, they have systematically silenced their critics and the news outlets carrying their messages. In August, a dozen radio stations, still a significant medium for those in the countryside, had their licenses suspended for carrying programs produced by US government-funded broadcasters RFA, Radio Free Asia, and VOA, Voice of America.
Radio, especially Radio Free Asia or other independent radio, contribute significantly to the result of the elections in Cambodia. We report the truth, and the truth really hurts the government. We broadcast, for example, about deforestation, and those businessmen who are conducting the deforestation are the children, nephew, nieces of the government official, and that really make the government really unhappy with us.
They saw them as a media that support the opposition party. These kinds of media bring a lot of things against the prime minister, against his power, against his interests, and of course they broadcast a lot of true, political situation. So to disconnect those people from the radio is a significant thing.
And it's not just radio. In September, the Cambodia Daily, a newspaper known for its fervent criticism of the government, was forced to print its final pages. Journalists believe it's their content the authorities are taking issue with, but the government is sticking to its line.
Look, the case of the Cambodia Daily or Radio Free Asia, they not abide by the law of the sovereign state. They not pay tax. And if you live in a civilized nation, tax evasion is a crime.
Trumped-up tax charges, closures, suspensions, these are just some of the tactics in Hun Sen's media playbook. The arrest of numerous reporters, usually on charges of treason or attempts to overthrow the government, has forced many journalists to flee the country and scared those who remain into silence. Case in point, a journalist we spoke to at the Phnom Penh Post, one of the few remaining outlets that still offers criticism of the government. The Post consistently calls the current situation a media crackdown. But once in front of our camera, the reporter whose identity we chose to disguise told a different story.
Cambodia, I think, is a fierce country on the media.
It's evident that there is some degree of self-censorship being practiced at the moment, because the Phnom Penh Post, of course, knows that it's fully possible that its operations will be made to stop as well.
And it isn't just those inside Cambodia. Hun Sen's scare tactics have proven effective well beyond the country's borders. Even interviewees we approached outside Cambodia were very reluctant to speak to us.
Cambodia is going through a huge transformation at the moment, and we just don't know yet where the lines will be drawn between what can be said and what can not be said. And in that situation, the most rational thing to do is to be very cautious. People at the moment are just sort of holding their breath.
If you dare to criticize the government, or you dare to speak the truth, you have to leave the country for fear of arrest and persecution. I myself have to leave the country, and the government issue arrest warrant against me. I cannot return to Cambodia.
With the space for traditional media shrinking, One online platform has offered an alternative: Facebook. A recent study by the Asia Foundation found that the network has, since 2016, become Cambodians' go-to source for the news. But in October last year, Facebook chose Cambodia as one of 6 countries to participate in an experiment, in which content from news publishers was pushed away from people's news feeds into a separate Explore section, unless they were prepared to pay to promote it. The effect was tangible.
When Facebook rolled out its Explore experiment in October, people were very concerned. The fear was that you would have a very biased situation where most independent media would be pushed onto the Explore field, and then other media, perhaps with the financial resources, would still be able to put their contents on the news feed.
The Facebook Explorer feed really affect our show, affect our reach to Cambodian audience. Anything we post on our page, it doesn't show to regular account. We have seen decrease in the number of people following our news.
The Facebook experiment played right into the hands of the Prime Minister, who seemed set on taking down all US-funded media outlets from the outset. Ever since the 2013 election, his party has accused these outlets of being part of an American conspiracy to topple the government. The irony is, the CPP has long been dependent on the US for aid. But those funds come with strings attached, preserving media freedoms, for example, not freedoms Hun Sen has been particularly happy to embrace.
The government never, value the democracy. They never value freedoms of media and press. They just value power. So election democracy is just only a game to attract foreign aids only. It's not a real commitment to democracy.
A commitment to democracy that Prime Minister Hun Sen no longer needs to comply with, thanks to a willing new partner, China.
When he closed down Cambodia, Delhi, and threat at the media, he kept raising the relationship he had with China. Probably the government tried to send a message to the US government that I'm not afraid of you, you are not my boss. This is my country.
I think the message is very clear. The Cambodian government has broken with the West, basically. They've broken with 2 decades of Western efforts to implant liberal democracy in the country. Cambodia's turn away from the West has been enabled by China's full political and economic support.
I think this argument is just childish. If you don't want to play with me, I play with others. I just want to clarify on this because a lot of people, they misunderstood this. If you are a leader of a country, like I said, you want to have a good friend with the US, you also want to have a good friend with China.
But if China's own record on press freedom is anything to go by, the new relationship between Phnom Penh and Beijing does not bode well for the Cambodian journalists silenced and the media outlets shut down. And voters in the run-up to a crucial election are getting less and less news and information, just the way Hun Sen likes it.
Finally, last year's presidential election in Kenya was not exactly a textbook exercise in democracy. The incumbent, Uhuru Kenyatta, won the August election, which his main rival, Raila Odinga, said was rigged. The courts agreed with that, ordered another vote in October, which Odinga then boycotted, saying it was never going to be a fair fight. So Kenyatta was eventually sworn in. But Odinga hasn't gone away. This past week, he held his own swearing-in ceremony, declaring himself the people's president. Now, KTN was one of 3 Kenyan television networks that planned to cover that event. The authorities ordered all 3 of them off the air, so KTN provided live coverage online. We're leaving you now with some images from both swearing-in ceremonies, Kenyatta's and Odinga's. Note the similarities, and the KTN anchor struggling to characterize this latest swearing-in ceremony that really wasn't. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
I, Uhuru Kenyatta, assume as President of the Republic of Kenya.
I, Raila Amolo Odinga, full realization of the high calling, assumed the office of the People's President of the Republic of Kenya.
A day that Kenyans have been waiting with the bated breath, with many doubting whether really it will get down to business. It has come to pass. So Raila Odinga, NASA leader, has just taken oath of office as a president of the people's, as president of the people.